Welcome, everybody. My name is Geoff McCombs. I am a managing consultant for DSWi. My office, actually, I'm based at our office in Salt Lake City, Utah. A little bit of background on me. I grew up in the Reno Tahoe area. Grew up in the Sierra Nevadas, skiing and doing all that, kind of mountain stuff, and then moved to Utah a little over 20 years ago. And my wife and I, we have 5 kids here in the suburb to Salt Lake City. I've been in supply chain for really my entire career for the past, I would say, 25 years. When I actually got my bachelor's degree in supply chain and operations and logistics back in early 2000s, over 20 years ago, and back then when I settled on that degree, nobody really knew what supply chain and logistics was, and thanks to COVID, supply chain has sort of become it's really changed the profession where it's sort of on everybody's mind now, and so it's kind of interesting to see that evolution of the discipline. Over the last 20 years that I've been in the industry, and been in consulting for the last few years as an independent consultant, and now with DSWi, and happy to be here and to present some current challenges and best practices in supply chain. Now, John will be moderating. What we're going to do is he will have all the microphones turned off, but if you'd like to ask a question and you don't want to wait until the end, feel free to drop a question into the chat window, and John will interrupt me, and hopefully I can answer that question in real time. But I welcome your comments and your questions, maybe personal experiences, and then at the end, if you have any additional questions, we will open it up to questions, and I'd be happy to answer them to the best of my ability. So I want to start off by talking a little bit about what we've sort of gone through over the last few years from a supply chain standpoint. As you all know, the global pandemic sort of wreaked havoc on global supply chains. Initially, driving down demand, and supply was there at sort of pre-COVID levels, and then post-COVID, as economies started turning back on and people going back to work and going back and ordering, goods and services online and elsewhere. There was sort of this post-pandemic flux of demand that was sort of unforeseen. In addition to that, there were sort of some labor challenges in there, and then global shipping capacity and that kind of thing. So we're going to talk about sort of where we've been over the last couple of years, where we are now, and what we sort of foresee in the future, and some best practices to sort of stay ahead of the curve, if you will, and right size and modernize our supply chain so that we can hopefully hedge against future challenges within the supply chain field. First, I want to talk a little bit about 6 areas that are currently impacting supply chains for the last couple of years. In manufacturing, because of sort of material scarcity, labor scarcity, and that kind of thing, manufacturing has certainly seen its challenges. Logistics, obviously, there have been challenges in the logistics field as well. When we speak of logistics, logistics actually is not used synonymously with supply chain. We define, logistics as sort of the global infrastructure in moving goods around the world. So that would include container shipping, ocean freight, container shipping, over-the-road trucking, and freight domestically, and then warehousing and inventory as well is sort of part of the logistics field. Challenges with inventory, pre-pandemic, moving into post-pandemic, there's been a lot of volatility because of reduction in demand and then increase in demand where a lot of companies could not keep up with demand. And so there's been significant volatility with inventory stocks in companies, and sort of some interesting things going on there globally. Market volatility, again, pricing, cost of goods and services. Over the last year, inflation has been a hot topic, and so the cost of a lot of materials has gone up as a result. Labor has been a challenge as well, and a lot of companies sort of struggling to staff, certainly unskilled labor, especially as the pandemic sort of changed how people interact with capital, available capital and labor, because of sort of some quantitative easing efforts that a lot of central banks have been employing to keep markets afloat. As a result, there's a lot of cash floating around, and companies are paying more, and so you've seen a lot of resignations as a result of that. And so labor, certainly unskilled labor, has certainly been a challenge. And then technology is always changing and providing solutions to all of these problems, and hopefully at DSWi we do that for our clients and help keep them on the cutting edge of technological evolution as we sort of confront these challenges. Again, let's talk specifically about logistics and some of the challenges that we've seen over the last year or two. Again, freight costs we talked about. Freight costs actually are not as much of an issue as they were, say, even 6 months ago, 6 to 12 months ago. We have seen a significant downward pressure in the cost of global freight, which is actually a good thing. I actually have a friend, my brother-in-law, in fact, is a freight broker and works for a firm here in the U.S. And he was telling me that the reason freight costs are down and the reason there's not as much port congestion is because there isn't as much demand. And I almost felt like saying, well, yeah, of course. I mean, it was always this sort of problem with global freight, domestic trucking, the port congestion that we were seeing over the last year was always a supply and demand issue. There being finite capacity for global shipping, whether it be containers or whether it be over-the-road trucking. That finite capacity, and a lot of companies not willing to invest capital to increase that capacity. In other words, buying new trucks, building new container ships, building more containers. Okay, the feeling was that this was sort of a flash in the pan, sort of a short-term problem, and so obviously companies are not going to invest capital, in some cases significant capital, to increase that capacity when they're not going to see the return on that investment, because it was potentially such a short-term problem. And so we just kind of had to work through that, and ultimately the supply the demand has alleviated a little bit, has come down, and we're actually starting to see significant global trade slow down, but potentially in the future. And so the freight costs, and I've got a few graphs that I'll talk about with what's going on with global freight and sort of how to keep ahead of it. Tariffs continue to be a problem on goods imported from China. It's I say problem. I probably shouldn't use that word. It's an opportunity, if you will. That sometimes these tariffs actually do provide an opportunity, in some cases leverage for domestic of suppliers of similar goods. And we are seeing sort of a shift, and I'll talk about later in the webinar a little bit about what we're seeing as a result of these tariffs and other things as well, the freight costs and that kind of thing that we've seen over the past year. We're starting to see a shift to what we call nearshoring, or bringing suppliers closer to our domestic manufacturing plants. Port congestion we talked about, and then inventory and warehousing during and post-pandemic. Warehousing was in short supply relative to demand. Cost of warehousing went up. Building new warehouses. I used to lament to a friend of mine in the consulting field a year or two ago that I should have bought a warehouse 20 years ago, because I'd probably be living on a desert island somewhere drinking drinking a pina colada, because the value of warehousing has significantly increased over the last 20 years, and in some cases very hard to find 3PLs and what we call third-party logistics providers, people who have warehouses and provide fulfillment services, especially as we've moved online in our purchasing, consumer purchasing anyway. Most of that is going online, and so there's a significant demand for distribution centers and warehouses, third-party logistics providers to provide these sort of fulfillment services. And inventory, immediately after the pandemic, as supply was going up, and as demand was going up and supply had sort of remained the same, companies reacting to that, obviously they could not react fast enough, and so we have sort of this lack of supply relative to demand, but as the pandemic, post-pandemic sort of transitioned into where companies could respond because of they just have time effectively, they started growing their inventory. Okay, and inventory is starting to grow, and then as demand's kind of subsiding, a lot of companies are dealing with excess inventory now, which is a significant problem in some cases. I want to talk a little bit about market trends in global freight. So I pulled this from an aggregator of global freight costs. It's a company called Freightos Baltic Index. In fact, I would strongly encourage those who are involved in global freight, or have international suppliers to either subscribe, get a free subscription to Freightos, or a paid subscription to get some of this data to sort of keep ahead of where the market is going in terms of global freight. It allows you to make sure that your freight brokers are giving you a competitive price, because you can benchmark it against sort of an index price that Freightos provides. Big company that provides really good information. This is global freight, so global container freight's an aggregate of all the cost of a 20-foot shipping container globally. Average cost, as you can see, post-pandemic, it spiked up above 10,000. This was globally a global aggregate average. In some areas of the world, it was up close to close to $20,000 just to ship a container overseas, and import from overseas into the United States. And so that has come down, fortunately, as sort of this demand has been alleviated somewhat relative to supply. China, this is a graph that shows a year-on-year snapshot of the last couple of years with regard to global container freight from China to the North American West Coast, which is where the vast majority of container shipping from China goes to, the West Coast. And so last year, this was increasing, and it peaked around the summer to about 20,000 per container. And then that's sort of where it peaked, and then has been on a steady decline since then, really, for the last six months or so, down to where it was in the pre-pandemic period. And so that's a good thing, where companies were really suffering because of the cost of global freight. It's now sort of stabilized a little bit, which is welcome news for those of us in the supply chain and logistics fields, but also those who source goods from overseas. I'm going to jump ahead. I want to talk about, speaking of market trends, I want to talk a little bit about commodities. I've had some clients over the years in the steel industry. In fact, some current clients as well, who have been sort of trying to keep ahead of the sort of understanding where the price of steel would go. And there are a lot of aggregated aggregators out there, websites that will take global market data, global indices, and aggregate that and provide data and commentary and analysis to their subscribers. And I would recommend doing that to understand cost drivers. A little later on, I'm going to talk about this slide in a little more detail with regard to some best practices that we can and data analytics that we can use to sort of keep our suppliers honest, if you will. This is just sort of a preface of that. But as you can see, this is nickel. Nickel is actually one of the leading indicators of where the price of steel is going to go, and the nickel futures. And it is wise. A lot of people in steel distribution and those who buy a lot of steel do track nickel to see where the price is going. As you can see, it has come down and stabilized somewhat to slightly above pre-pandemic levels, actually, but significantly down from the peak last year. So that's also a good thing. Some challenges in manufacturing. Again, we talked about rising cost of commodities. That has stabilized somewhat, but inflation is still a real concern. It has come down a little bit, I think, due to some recent monetary policy by the Federal Reserve. But again, we're still inflation is still sort of a problem that a lot of companies are facing: oil, steel, plastic feedstocks, lumber, and other things. Capacity, labor, and machine capacity. Labor continues to be sort of a stubborn problem. We see where we have high inflation, we have a very strong labor market. I think it was reported just last month, the economy added over 500,000 jobs, and so there doesn't appear to be a slowdown, at least in hiring. And so labor continues to be a problem. Now, sourcing, the similar upstream challenges are existing that were there pre and post pandemic, immediately after the pandemic, and so that still some challenges there that we're going to address. And finally, what I'm going to call I'm going to call, I didn't come up with this term, but what is called in the industry the NTier problem. And I will talk a little bit about that. But due to these sort of supply chain disruptions, there was a recent article by Steve Banker of Forbes, who's a supply chain and logistics contributor, and he recently noted that COVID supply disruptions have brought home the need for better supply chain risk management. And multinational corporations knew that events could occur that could cost them tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. This was pre-pandemic, but the events were not predictable. They might happen, they might not happen. And so many individual events that could occur were rare and labeled quote unquote black swan events, or just rare events. And so as a result, many companies did not invest capital to mitigate this risk. And that includes technology. Companies typically embraced improved supply chain risk management only after a disaster, after the horse had already fled the burning barn, if you will. Now, for example, after the Fukushima disaster in Japan, the auto industry only then embraced some risk management because of that. So in some cases, some sole sourcing that they had with companies in Japan. And COVID, in many ways, was sort of a Fukushima category event that applied to all industries as well. That obviously unforeseen, but caused some major volatility in global markets that we're still sort of dealing with. And so some of this volatility in manufacturing, the forces that are driving this, and I've talked about this in previous slides, but inflation, post-pandemic demand, material scarcity, labor, and then a finite shipping infrastructure, as we've discussed. Now, Stephen Banker of Forbes also noted that as companies embraced risk mitigation solutions after the pandemic, they discovered that while some of these solutions were very good at identifying risks in real time, just one tier up in the supply chain. And when we talk about one tier up in the supply chain, what that means is your direct supplier is one tier up. The next tier up is the supplier to your supplier. Third tier up is so on and so forth, up the supply chain. Those are the tiers. And so many companies were identifying risks and what, but it was only good to identify sort of problems and risks one tier up in the supply chain with their direct suppliers. This is called but what they're discovering is that they could not identify risks occurring several tiers up in the supply chain. This is what's called the NTier problem. N number of tiers up, there are problems up the supply chain that we do not have visibility to, that we're suffering from, okay, that impact us. And so COVID supply disruptions, as it turned out, very frequently were an NTier problem because of COVID. One example, the auto industry, which lost billions because of the semiconductor chip shortage. Okay, everybody's heard about this, all right, it's been in the news for the last couple of years. They had suppliers that could not get chips they needed for their products. And so the OEMs could not get the sub-assemblies and the car components they needed, okay? So further up than just the first tier in the supply chain. This N-tier problem is a current popular expression for something that supply chain experts for decades have been calling, and many of you may have heard of it, it's called the Bullwhip Effect, okay? And I want to sort of go into this and talk a little bit about the Bullwhip Effect. And in philosophy, what the Bullwhip Effect is small variation in consumer demand to the left of the graph here results in large variation upstream in the supply chain the further up you get, okay? So a bullwhip. Some call it the butterfly effect, okay, where a butterfly flaps its wings in Central Park and it causes a tsunami over in Asia or something, or a typhoon in Asia. Same kind of idea. So the bullwhip effect, as there are small fluctuations in consumer demand at the customer level, the retailer, as a result, will react to those fluctuations at the first tier, okay? And what they'll do is maybe they'll stock more inventory, okay? Or maybe they're going to call their supplier and they're going to say, you know what, change our order. We want to double that order, okay? And so what happens is now second tier up in the supply chain, the wholesaler says, wow, I've got all these retailers that are increasing their order quantities and they're screaming at me to deliver faster and not be late. So I'm going to double my order to my manufacturer upstream in the supply chain. And so then so on and so forth, on and up and to the raw material source, okay, with the supplier further up in the supply chain. And so as a result, you have this small fluctuation in consumer demand that wreaks havoc on supply chains upstream. All right, and what we want to look at is sort of how we mitigate the impact upstream in the supply chain when the small fluctuations in consumer demand downstream happen. And so one way to do that is visibility. Okay, so as I mentioned before, this N-tier problem where companies were looking just one tier up and seeing, you know, just at their immediate supplier level, the risks that were involved. What we really want to do is we want to look further up the supply chain to see the risks that are happening more than one tier up. So even before COVID, many companies were engaging their upstream suppliers beyond tier one, all right, to mitigate supply chain risks that originated downstream. Aerospace companies have been doing it for years, Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and others. They've been leveraging their purchasing power to engage negotiate and even use contractual instruments or enter into contracts with their upstream suppliers beyond tier 1. Okay, and in some cases, what they would tell their immediate suppliers, they would say, you can only buy from this manufacturer or this group of manufacturers because we've qualified them from a quality standpoint and we've negotiated contracts with them. All right, and so aerospace and others, certainly in regulated industries, have been doing this for years. And the more sophisticated companies will do this, where they will engage their suppliers further up. So we need to look upstream the supply chain to the second, third, and even fourth tier suppliers. Sophisticated companies are doing this, okay? So don't be afraid to engage with these suppliers, because if you're not, it's likely that your competitors are. All right. And so what they're doing is they're shrinking their lead times, or they're going to be able to react faster to changes in demand as they occur. All right. Somebody's going to do it. And if it's not you, it's going to be your competitors. So don't be afraid to engage with these suppliers. It is not uncommon. They're not going to be surprised when you call them. I think letting your immediate suppliers know that you're looking upstream, full disclosure there is always a good practice with your immediate suppliers, obviously, because there are partnerships there and there's trust, and you don't want them to think you're doing an end run around them. But it is also wise, and if possible, you can engage, even align priorities, and possibly incentivize your upstream suppliers, okay? Some companies will even write profit-sharing clauses in their contracts with their second and third tier suppliers, profit sharing. The idea here is to smooth this curve, this bullwhip effect, or this NTier problem, if you will. When, in addition to that, sharing data upstream and priorities and incentives, aligning those priorities and those incentives. When that's done, sharing data, aligning priorities, and incentivizing upstream suppliers, amazing things can happen within a supply chain. Okay, this will help you reduce your demand variability. Okay, and provide more supply chain agility. All right. And quite honestly, your upstream suppliers, beyond your tier 1 suppliers, will thank you, okay? Because they have because they would not only help you, okay? There's incentive for them to get data from you, because they can see downstream sort of what's happening. And believe me, they're doing this with their other customers, all right? And so the more information they have, and if I were to reverse this little guy with the binoculars, reverse it and put him under the tier 4 supplier, having him look back the opposite direction. All right, we're helping them, and in turn, they're going to be able to help us. So ultimately, it's our goal to smooth this curve. All right, to reduce demand volatility upstream in the supply chain. All right, and here are some strategies to reduce this risk and sources of volatility within a supply chain, and to smooth the curve. This we're going to talk more about this. This is a webinar series. These supply chain webinars will be a series throughout 2023, and so we don't have a lot of time to go into detail on all of these. But as we have future webinars, I will discuss these in detail and some strategies here. In engaging with your upstream beyond your tier 1 suppliers. So understanding cost drivers, aligning your supply chain upstream, sharing data, understanding your own data and sharing data, vertical integration in some cases, setting up strategic partnerships, and doing frequent supplier reviews. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between agile and resilient in the business world. Many people talk about agile and resilient as synonymously as the same thing. They're not. For the last 20 years of my career, I've been preaching to organizations, both that I've worked inside of or consulted, that world-class supply chains must have both agility and resilience. In addition to becoming somewhat cliche, many business professionals are using these interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. So a company with an agile supply chain, let's talk about agile for a second. A company with an agile supply chain can react quickly to rapid changes in downstream demand. Okay, we talked about sort of that volatility downstream. This is not done by carrying excessive levels of inventory, okay? For some companies, it is their stated strategy to carry large quantities of inventory, excuse me, to hedge against rapid and unpredictable swings in demand. I worked for one such company actually early in my career, and it was their stated strategy. We're just going to carry a lot of inventory because our demand is so volatile and fluctuates. Now, while these organizations will justify this strategy by saying that, oh, well, the industry or business model require it, or it's just simply the cost of doing business, even while scrapping millions. I've seen it with clients and companies I've worked inside of. Maybe you've seen some of this. Scrapping millions every year in obsolete inventory. We should soundly reject these excuses. There's a better way. And it's not by tying up excessive levels of working capital in inventory, not the most effective way to respond quickly to customer demand. But it's possibly the most risky. Parenthetically, actually, I'll say that many companies will justify this flawed inventory strategy in order to avoid the regret and inevitable soul searching. It's difficult, okay, that ensues when they choose to be honest with themselves about their inventory strategy. It's a difficult process. It's change from how a lot of companies have operated for years, and that's difficult. One actually great example, and I don't have time to get into it in detail, but as Toyota began to dominate the automobile market in the 1980s, they started gobbling up market share. American car manufacturers were caught flat-footed and started looking closely at the Toyota model to understand what Toyota was doing differently. And what they discovered would revolutionize the automobile industry the same way that Henry Ford revolutionized it, at the early part of the 20th century. Amazingly, though, what they discovered in the Toyota model would not take hold, at least for another 20 years, in American automobile manufacturing in the automobile industry. And in some cases was even dismissed or even criticized that Toyota's lean manufacturing methodology would, many said, well, it works in Japan, but it would never work here in the United States. Today, however, the Toyota production system has been wholeheartedly adopted by many U.S. industries, including the automobile industry. And actually, this story is documented in a book called The Toyota Way by Jeffrey Liker. I highly recommend that book for those who are interested in lean manufacturing. But sophisticated organizations recognize and exploit opportunities within their supply chain with the goal of improving customer service while simultaneously driving down inventory. Okay? Both are possible. All right? Agile, so agile supply chains, many of which we will discuss. We'll discuss some cases throughout the course of this webinar series. But one such strategy actually was called Bright Can, quote unquote Bright Can, and it was pioneered by Coca-Cola in the late 1970s. I don't have time to get into it now, but we'll talk about it in future webinars. But it changed the way bottlers, and in fact, I consulted one of the major bottling companies for Coca-Cola, and one day I was with one of their executives, and I asked him if that was really true, this Bright Can story, and he did confirm that it was, and it changed the way bottlers responded to changes in consumer demand while also driving down inventory. Patagonia, the outdoor clothing company, has also employed similar agile strategies, and we'll talk about these cases in future webinars. But more modern and sophisticated companies, on the other hand, like Coke and Patagonia and others, will leverage business intelligence and opportunities with upstream suppliers to create an agile supply chain. All right. Now, within the orbit of agile, we find four areas that we will discuss in future webinars: postponement, nearshoring, market sensitivity, and virtual. Okay. Now, within the resilient orbit, nearshoring also applies. Okay. And there are others. This is not a comprehensive list, but they share some characteristics, and some will separate them. Okay. But agile is characterized by postponement. When I say postponement, it means pushing what we call the push-pull threshold, which we'll talk about in future webinars, closer to the customer, so that we can understand customer demand, from the source. And so effectively postponing the manufacturing until the very last minute when you receive a customer order. Okay. And we'll talk about some ways to do that in future webinars. What we call market sensitivity, understanding, kind of having feelers out there in the market for what's going on in the market, and understanding how that applies to your business. Nearshoring, meaning bringing suppliers closer to you physically. Now, that can happen in terms of vertical integration, but it can also happen just bringing. I know, over the last several years, companies have relied on Chinese manufacturing, and really China as a supplier to U.S. companies, it's not going to change anytime soon. I mean, we are attached at the hip, whether we like it or not, with China. And what I've said actually is China is a triple threat, and what I mean by that is China has three things that no other country on earth at this moment has. And not even the United States, actually. So what China has is they have a modern 21st century infrastructure, in some cases even better than the United States, for those of you who have been to China. So they have a modern infrastructure. So in terms of logistics, it's easy to get goods to market faster with a modern infrastructure. They have engineering capability, okay, and manufacturing capabilities that are first rate, okay? And third, they have cheap labor. There is no other country on the planet that has all three of those. The United States might have two, but we don't have cheap labor. Latin America, for example, has the cheap labor, but they're lacking in sort of this infrastructure and engineering and manufacturing capabilities. All right, so China, at least for the short term, potentially long term, will continue to be a major force in providing goods to the world. But we're starting to see a shift, I think a post-pandemic shift, where a lot of companies actually are bringing. In fact, there's an article in the Wall Street Journal this week about companies, the increase of demand for warehousing on the border between Mexico and the United States, because a lot of companies are bringing are sourcing back to Latin America, shifting from China back to Latin America. So nearshoring is an opportunity as well. On the resilient side, we have the difference here between agile and resilient. Building a resilient supply chain means a supply chain that can that is sort of means tested, or can survive shocks that happen to the economy as they occur, or maybe that are unforeseen. And so providing a hedge against those shocks is going to be important. So there's multi-sourcing, putting buffers, capacity, and even inventory buffers, and then platform and plant harmonization, or what I call synchronization, is a way to make a supply chain more resilient. Now, what do we choose? Do we choose agile or resilient? Okay, now an agile company or supply chain can react quickly to these big increases and decreases in demand, or it can see a supply chain or logistics disruption that will impact them faster than their competition. All right, there was a movie several years ago called Margin Call, and there's a quote in that movie where the executive comes into a board meeting, and he says, in this business we've got to do one of three things. We've either got to beat our competitors, either to cheat, to be smarter, or to be faster. We don't cheat, so that leaves us to be smarter and faster, and it's a heck of a lot easier to be first. All right, and so being faster than the competition is what an agile supply chain will allow you to do. And so this advanced visibility upstream of the supply chain will allow them to move, to lock up items in short supply or needed transport faster than their competitors. All right, now a resilient supply chain, resilient company is doing what they can to prepare for inevitable shocks that they will face. So these companies are moving to procure key components from more suppliers. They're ensuring that suppliers of similar components are not located in the same region, so sort of diversifying their supplier base. And they're doing more nearshoring, like I talked about, all right, bringing some of their customers or their suppliers closer, much like Dell pioneered in the 80s and 90s, where they brought all of their suppliers into their campus, all right, and had daily deliveries, and they really broke the mold in terms of running an agile and resilient supply chain. So bringing suppliers closer or finding closer suppliers. So resilient companies are building in supply and capacity buffers also in a targeted way. Now you're going to ask, wait a second, didn't you just tell us that building inventory is a bad thing? Okay. Yes, it is, and you can target the way you stock your inventory, and we can talk about some strategies in future webinars. But many companies are also adding supplier risk management duties to their sourcing tasks. So in other words, going out, means testing suppliers, making sure that they're healthy enough to be able to continue providing goods for the long term as a supplier. So in short, agility is about being able to react faster, and resilience is about preparation. I want to talk a little bit about this, and I'll end with this. Looks like we're about time, and we'll open it up to questions. But I want to go back to this example of the steel industry. I had a company I worked with several years ago who bought a lot of steel, and so they were keenly interested in any potential fluctuations in the price of steel, because obviously they're quoting to their customers, and as the price of steel increased, it would just completely erase their margins. And so steel was an important thing for them. And so when we talk about being agile and being resilient in your supply chain, being agile and resilient, market data is going to be very, very important. Understanding cost drivers for commodities that you source, okay? Now, in this case, we're looking at nickel here. Nickel is a primary driver of the price of steel, okay? Not the only driver, but it is a driver for both carbon steel and certainly stainless steel, especially stainless steel, by the way. And so it is well worth the investment to either subscribe to one of these websites that aggregate market data for their subscribers, and they provide analysis as well to track the price of some of these commodities that are driving the cost of what you source from your suppliers. Now, this helps because, again, like the company that I mentioned, it helps so that they can sort of foresee changes in the market so that they can adjust their bids accordingly. But it also allows you to keep your suppliers honest. Okay, I worked with a company several years ago who purchased rare earth magnets, and we had to understand the drivers of these rare earth magnets, and so we tracked the market price for these rare earth magnets. When the price started to go up, it provided context, and it allowed us to sort of prepare. But as the prices came down, we could hold our suppliers accountable, keep them honest, if you will, that as the prices came down, we knew that their prices were coming down as well, and it provided much needed visibility so that we could go into negotiations with that armed with that information, so that we could keep them honest as we negotiated contracts and negotiated pricing. So it's going to be very important to track sort of these commodity prices. There are aggregators out there for plastic feedstocks of all varieties. One company that I've used is a company called Argus Metals, and I've had subscriptions to their website that aggregates data on virtually every commodity globally, and this is very important information to retain. With that, we are at about 11:50 Central. I'm going to end there. Next time, we're going to get into inventory, stocking inventory in a smart way, using both market data and historical demand data within the company, historical usage data to determine appropriate stocking levels for inventory. This is one that's very near and dear to my heart. And when I say that we can increase customer satisfaction while reducing inventory, that is true, and I will talk a little bit about that on the next webinar. And so with that, I'm going to open it up to questions.